Thank you. I will benefit from the situation that I follow, that my presentation follows Balázs's presentation, and in the sense that I won't repeat many of the things this very extensive analysis has mentioned. I am going to focus to add, if possible, some further aspects. So, ever since the change of the political regime in Hungary and Romania, several cinematic attempts have emerged to depict the social cultural realities of Eastern Europe, to cope with the past traumas experienced by both nations, to revive collective and cultural memory, to grab the Eastern European specificity that makes the region the other of Western Europe. Several Hungarian and Romanian films set themselves the task of processing the traumas experienced in the communist regime, of revaluing the Romanian Revolution, of unveiling mechanisms of mediation, the relationship between private memory and cultural memory, the quest of the past as self-quest, etc. Besides the attention focused on the past, several films feature women focusing on female traumas, women between the East and the West, trapped by social institutions, the female body as a carrier of power relations. These films display various discursive trends, from the magic realist tendency in the young Hungarian film to the minimalist realism of Romanian new wave cinema, as well as various stylistic and rhetorical specificities, from minimalism, micro-realism, naturalism, to excessive stylization, reflexivity, and exploration of intermedial relations. One mode of representing the Central Eastern European condition is magic realism. By definition, magic realism combines realism and the fantastic in such a way that magical elements grow organically out of the reality portrayed. Tamás Bényei goes beyond reading the obscure term merely as an oxymoron and defines magic realism as an international phenomenon constituting an integrative part of postmodern discourse. The magic component of the phrase refers, on the one hand, to the visual aspects, to the rhetorical and narrative specificities of the literary discourse. On the other hand, it also implies an ontological layer of meaning referring to a particular way of reading by virtually transgressing the boundaries of reality existence. In young Hungarian film, there is a tendency of representing the social, cultural, ethnic diversity and incompatibilities that characterize Central Eastern European existence with all its ambivalences and absurdities, constituting the preconditions for the carnivalesque type of rendering, as it manifests in Emir Kusturica's oeuvre. In young Hungarian film, magic realism may appear as a genre-shaping dominant, aiming at the re-territorialization